Good morning, dear colleagues, dear guests. Before we start today's hearing, just some household remarks. We will be using Introductory for those who want to participate or who want to follow our hearing remotely. So if you are participating remotely and you wish to take the floor, please kindly press the raise hand button so that you can be put on the speakers list and we can give you the floor. We've got interpretation for today's hearing in the following language: English, German, French, Italian, Dutch, Greek, Spanish, Finnish, Slovenian, Czech, Polish, Slovakian, Bulgarian, Romanian, and Hungarian. Speakers are invited to use their mother tongue if it is one of the languages for which interpretation is available. And please note that interpreters rely on the quality of the sound and the video of remote participants in order to get your message across. So please be aware that phone interventions or only audio connections will not be interpreted. And then lastly, this hearing is being broadcasted live on YouTube in English and Polish. So thank you all for joining us here today to discuss the Pegasus scandal and its impact on democracy and rule of law. And given that we have such an interesting panel of speakers today, I'm going to keep my introductory remarks very short because I'm really more interested to listen what our guests have to say rather than speaking myself. I just want to make two considerations. Firstly, that in my personal opinion, we cannot overemphasize the severity of this situation. And I think it's important for all of us to try and put ourselves in the position of the victims here, just for a moment. For a moment, try to imagine that a government reads every single message you share with your loved ones, that every video you watch on your phone is being watched with you, that at all times, people that do not have your best interest at heart are aware of your exact whereabouts. That should, I think, already immensely scare you. And I know it scares me, but my fear is nothing compared to the fears of journalists scrutinizing not so democratic governments, to opposition politicians, activists, NGOs, lawyers, who are considered an inconvenience by the powers that be in their countries. And that is why it's important that this European Parliament will always stand behind and fight alongside the victims of such attacks, and to do so with strength and vigor. Because the effect of such attacks also reach beyond the direct victims. It has a chilling effect on anybody who wants to speak out, on anybody who wants to scrutinize their government and defend democracy and rule of law. It has an effect on everybody who wants to enjoy the democratic freedom to oppose a present majority. It directly undermines democracy and rule of law, and it cannot continue unchallenged. Second consideration, which is important as well, is that it's not about national security. It is about the rule of law. It is not about being allowed or not allowed to use technology to fight organized crime or terrorism, because I strongly believe technological innovation can help us keep us all safe. Criminals and terrorists deploy more and more advanced technology, and law enforcement needs to be able to follow. But that is not what this is about. This is about the abuse of technology for political gain and about the complete absence of proper checks and balances. And this hearing is not a standalone hearing. We have already discussed Pegasus twice at the level of the LIBE committee in this House. We will have a debate next week at the plenary session in Strasbourg. There will be a joint LIBE-AFCO mission traveling to Poland that will also reflect on the Pegasus issue. And because this is such a crucial issue to us, we're also organizing a EPP Group mission to Poland under the leadership of our Vice President Esteban González Pons to try and collect as much relevant information as possible. And then yesterday at the meeting of the group leaders of this parliament, the idea of a parliamentary inquiry committee on the issue was proposed, and it received the support of a majority of groups. Now, of course, the exact details and the content of the mandate will need to be still discussed and agreed, but it's an important signal that also the European Parliament as an institution will significantly intensify its work on the matter. And in that sense, I believe the timing of today's hearing is perfect. And I would already like to invite our guests today also to reflect upon what aspects of the Pegasus scandal would be most important to include in the scope of the investigations that this Parliament will undertake. Now, at today's hearing, we will look at the Pegasus scandal and its impact on democracy and rule of law from many perspectives. We will hear from the journalists from Forbidden Stories that played a crucial role in uncovering the scandal. And we are very happy that director Laurent Richard and editor-in-chief Sandrine Rigaud are with us today connected. We're also very honored to have with us Roman Giertych, who is one of the most prominent victims of the use of Pegasus by the Polish government. And we look very much forward to hear from him. And since this is not only a Polish issue, but very much a European issue, we are pleased to welcome Matej Zsabo, who is the Director of Programs at the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union and is a specialist in the protection of fundamental freedoms and informational rights. And last but not least, we will hear from Bill Marczak, who is a Senior Research Fellow at Citizen Lab, who have been absolutely instrumental in researching the technology and providing the forensic digital evidence on many Pegasus hacks. Now, I'm looking forward to hear from all our guests, but before we do, it is my honor to give the floor to our colleague Andrzej Halicki, member of the European Parliament and leader of the Polish delegation in the EPP Group, to kick off this hearing. He is one of the strongest and most active voices when it comes to defending democracy and rule of law in this European Parliament, and it's my pleasure to give him the floor for 10 minutes. He's remotely connected, but please, Andrzej, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As it was asked, I will use my mother tongue, Polish, so chciałbym bardzo podziękować za...
Thank you very much indeed for organizing this hearing. As a Vice President of the LIBE committee that works on such issues as justice and liberty, I would like to repeat what the chairman has already stressed. It's not about Poland, it's not about Hungary. What is at stake is the safety and security of our citizens. It's about checks and balances, including when it comes to secret services. New technologies are naturally being used by secret services. I used to be a minister for digitization, so I am aware of that those technologies need to be used to fight terrorism and serious crime. The relevant services need to have such tools at their disposal, but there is one condition. Such tools cannot be used to fight democracy, cannot be used against the political activists, journalists, members of the opposition. They cannot be used in a politicized way. Unfortunately, we have encountered many problems with regard to the use of such instruments. To talk about it is the very objective of our hearing. What is established beyond any doubt now is that such instruments were used against people who are very important for democracy. What we need are free and fair elections. So how can we turn a blind eye to the fact that during the election campaign in 2019, the campaign for the elections for the European Parliament, one of the organizers of the political campaigns, Krzysztof Brejza, was targeted by an attack. We cannot ignore all this. We have the Supreme Chamber of Control in Poland, which is in our system a very important body. It was also under attack. 500 electronic devices have been hacked. There are many systems such as Pegasus or Predator. They are used for surveillance, for collecting data about contacts and messages. But that's not all. Of course, let me repeat that if we are talking about criminal offenses, such technologies may be used, But unfortunately, this technology also makes it possible to modify the messages, to doctor the messages, in order to create a false image of the messages. And this happened in Poland. Messages that were later publicized were doctored, had been changed, which is even more dangerous. We need to collect data on this. We need to try establish what had happened, and I'm glad that there will be missions to individual member states. In Strasbourg next week we are going to have a debate on this issue, but we also need a number of serious decisions. I hope that in the LIBE committee and in the European Parliament in general, we will try to seriously think about this. Are we able to protect our democracy? Are we able to protect fair elections? Do we have enough safeguards for our citizens, especially those who are being targeted, especially those who are on a collision course with the government? We cannot allow abuse of these surveillance systems by the government. Those tools cannot be used in a different way than the intended legitimate purpose. We have experts here, they will share their knowledge, but I think there is a long way in front of us. I will wrap up here. Thank you very much. One more time, I'm very glad that we can talk about this. And now I hand over back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, André, for those important words. And we move on immediately to our next speakers in the panels. As I already announced, we will start with Laurent Richard and Sandrine Rigaud from Forbidden Stories, both experienced and distinguished journalists that have played important roles in revealing the Pegasus scandal, and we're very happy to have you here today. You are together remotely connected, so you have 10 minutes to divide among yourselves between you. Please, you have the floor.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup pour
Good morning. We're very pleased to be connected with you today. Interpreter would like to point out that the sound is not perfect. There's a bit of an echo. I'll do my best. So, there were 80 journalists and 20 press organisations that were involved in looking into this, and we came up against this unprecedented espionage operation in a number of countries that were affected, and something they had in common was that they all had Pegasus virus software from the NSO group. And through spying, these countries often think that it's just a question of attacking citizens, but what we're seeing on the use of this ultra-sophisticated Pegasus software, that we're looking at thousands of victims across the world who are being spied on, and their entire data is being stolen by security services who are investigating them, and in almost every case, there is no scrutiny exercised here. So, as I say, 80 journalists were brought together and 20 press organisations. And we're talking about 50,000 euros here, which is what the NSO group asked as the entry price to get into this Pegasus group. And the NSO group claim, and a number of states involved, claim certain things, yet we have noted that these claims are unwarranted, and there are problems where we're talking about not just individuals but their lawyers as well being targeted, and all these people who we have seen targeted in our files, we have sometimes found technical and scientific proof of this hacking. All of these people are considered dangerous to certain powers, be they human rights activists, be they because they're seen as threats to a regime, and so these states have carried out this espionage. We worked with partners who I think can tell you more about the use of this software.
Je vous raconterai un petit peu comment nous avons travaillé en partant de cette liste de 50 000 cibles potentielles. Il a d'abord fallu identifier les personnes.
Yes, there are people behind the numbers. We just have these telephone numbers. It's been a very difficult job of work.
Avec 2 ou 3 sources supplémentaires, c'est cette identité.
And we, of course, verify things before we publish anything. We've been able to identify hundreds of victims in more than 50 countries. Amongst those victims, at the time of publication, we already identified 180 journalists, but also tens of human rights defenders, heads of government, heads of state. You will have heard of those, but doctors, university staff, researchers, lawyers. The main idea initially was to identify these targets and then look at these targets and find the proof of attack or targeting. And this was important before we published. This wouldn't have been possible without the support of of Amnesty International. And they have been looking into Pegasus software, and they've managed to develop software to find traces on telephones. They've also set up a platform to allow us to remotely check phones. We've taken huge amounts of cautious steps to make sure we're not endangering these people who are considered dangerous to regimes. We've carried out hundreds of different analyses, and what we've seen is this targeting was confirmed by what we saw in the telephones of the victims. It's extremely dangerous because this sort of hacking is something that is still ongoing during the course of our investigation, so we have to be extremely cautious. Also, there was an issue where we could only find traces of this spyware on the iPhones, and we looked at these iPhones, and if they were using iPhones at the time that they were identified, we did find Pegasus traces. It's important to underscore that the most recent iPhones or updates have not prevented victims from being hacked. The report from Amnesty International made public. It's something that's being used by certain security services and investigation services around the world working on Pegasus. And these analyses from the investigators really confirmed and corroborated our own suspicions. On top of that, through using that methodology, we've seen that there are other ways that Pegasus is attacking. For example, Apple has been aware of this. Several Apple files were used or exploited by Pegasus to access the phones. Apple decided to contact the victims, and tens of additional victims then came to light and can be added to the list that we had as of July. As I said, it was extremely complicated to carry out this analysis of telephones and to find traces because this software is invisible. So for years now, the spyware has exploited shortcomings in the phone's software and in the phone's hardware, and these exploits, as they're called, are being used very well by NSO Group. So they're using those exploits to remain invisible. Once these spyware's on the phone, it's extremely dangerous because then it can extract all data, be it encrypted messages, photos, address books, and to deal with that, there's basically nothing a victim can do. It's basically somebody looking over your shoulder who's reading every single thing that comes up, including encrypted messages, be it WhatsApp or other messages. It's basically reading everything that you're reading, and that constitutes a security issue. We have met large numbers of victims, and these victims often have a profile of people seeking refuge, leaving their countries, fleeing terrible regimes, Bahrain, for example, or others. And because of Pegasus, because of this tracking software, they can even be found elsewhere, even if they make it to London or Paris, other capitals, other democracies. So it's a software that once autocrats have access to this, there is no scrutiny to check how it's being used and who is being used against. So it constitutes a massive attack on civil liberties and the respect of human rights. So 80 journalists were involved in this investigation, despite the large number of journalists involved, despite the combined powers of this, looking into the Pegasus project. We still haven't received any answers. Even in Europe, we haven't received answers. Nevertheless, the topic of Pegasus, the problem of Pegasus, is a European one. If we look at the funding here, we know that Israel has a lot of support in financial terms from the EU. We know that NSO Group has shareholders providing finance from European quarters. So it's a European subject as well, because NSO themselves say that most of their clients are within the European Union. The problem is we haven't received any answers despite our requests put as journalists. None of the member states has replied to us. Who is buying this software in Europe? Nobody is saying that they have been using Pegasus. We see that the BKA in Germany, for example, have used Pegasus. We don't know in which context that was, what mechanisms of control and monitoring, what checks and balances are in place. We really don't know. We're going to continue along this line of investigation, but we certainly hope that the committee of inquiry that's hopefully going to start its work soon will be able to make headway. We still don't have access to this sort of information, but hopefully this committee could garner a lot of information for journalists, for public opinion, and for citizens as well, who don't have any means to protect themselves against this malicious spyware. So we have a great deal of hope and expectation from this newly created committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I share your hope and expectations for this inquiry committee, in particular, indeed, to gather as much as evidence and information as possible, and I am sure that we will also come back to Forbidden Stories and the work that you have done once we get this committee up and running, because I think your contributions to the fact that there is going to be these kind of debates and these kind of inquiry committees has been absolutely important. So thank you very much for being with us, and we will do all the panelist contributions in one go, and then we'll have an overall Q&A sessions where you can direct your questions to each of the panelists. So thank you very much, and we move on. I'm very honored that Mr. Roman Girti is here with us today. I'm happy to give him the floor. You're an attorney. It became known that while you were conducting cases for, among others, Donald Tusk, that you were subject to surveillance by the Pegasus software program, as later also confirmed by the Citizen Lab. And I think your story and your personal experience are very valuable to our hearing here today. And I am happy but mostly honored to have you here with us in person. And I give you the floor also for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will speak in Polish because there is a lot of Polish media today with us. John Scott Railton,
an expert from Citizen Lab, famously said that Pegasus is a proverbial canary in the coal mine. A canary in the coal mine, pointing to a far greater danger. Miners used to take a canary down with them underground because that would be a harbinger, a sign of a possible explosion of methane. By the same token, Pegasus today is symptomatic of a possible threat to democracy. What has been happening in Israel recently is also very telling. There is a committee on Pegasus, allegedly with the aim to protect democracy. How is an authoritarian state being created? The first stage is to destroy the democratic scrutiny, the checks and balances system when it comes to what the secret services and the public prosecutor are doing. Those services are becoming politicized. They are no longer working for justice. They are working for the politicians. We tend to forget what is happening in Poland, or let me rephrase it. We tend to forget how it has all started. It hasn't started with me, it hasn't started with Senator Brejza. The first victim was Donald Tusk himself, when he was the president of the European Council. Let me tell you a few words about what happened. In the first term of his term in office, he was regularly harassed by the Polish prosecution, by the special committees in the Polish parliament. He was summoned many times. He had to participate in hearings that would last for hours. He had to appear before the special committee. So did his son. I was honored to be able to represent Donald Tusk back then. In Poland, the process of creating an authoritarian state was already underway, and lawyers are always the first victims, the first targets of those who want to create an authoritarian state. Why is that? Lawyers are protecting citizens from the abuse on the part of the state. That is why they are being targeted. Lawyers are creating a safeguard, a barrier, are protecting citizens, are defending citizens in a situation where the authority is abusing its powers. Therefore, we are being targeted as lawyers. And I would say it's quite typical, because the very same thing is happening elsewhere, in other authoritarian countries or countries with authoritarian tendencies. Let us look at Russia. One of the very first victims of the Putin's regime was a lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Now we have an act using his name in honor of Magnitsky. We have an act that imposes sanctions on Russia. It's called Magnitsky Act. Magnitsky was assassinated in prison. Unfortunately, Poland is not there yet. I was being prosecuted. There were attempts to deprive me of my capacity to act as a lawyer. There were disciplinary cases against me, and the body responsible for that was the illegal disciplinary chamber that fined me. What I would like to share with you today is something that I consider crucial, including for the Parliament and for the EU institutions. The fact that my phone was infected with Pegasus is the starting point of that story. I did share the report about this hack, the report from Citizen Lab. It is available. It all started on the 5th of September 2019, as early as that. 5th of September 2019. Donald Tusk texted me back then, told me he changed his phone number. I received a message to that effect from Donald Tusk. I'm not sure it's a coincidence. I think that someone was hacking, was intercepting, was eavesdropping on Donald Tusk. I don't know whether they were using Pegasus or not. But clearly, life became more difficult for them because Tusk changed his phone number, and therefore they switched to me. And via me, they wanted to wiretap, intercept the contact, the messages between me and Donald Tusk. So I wasn't the main target, I would say. It was Tusk. It was Donald Tusk that was the main target. In 2019, everyone was anxiously waiting for Tusk to say whether or not he was going to run for the position of the president in Poland. Law and Justice was scared that he could possibly run as such a potentially frightening enemy, so they wanted to establish what he is up to. During this period of enhanced surveillance, I was being spied on in Poland, but also in Italy. Back then, I was working on a visit of Donald Tusk, the then President of the European Council, to Pope Francis. I was preparing this visit, I was working on it. And I would say that this surveillance in Italy was linked to that visit. Perhaps someone expected that following the visit to the Vatican, Tusk would formally announce that he is going to run for president. That didn't happen. The government failed to find anything incriminating Tusk or me, for that matter, during this period. However, some delicate political issues and legal issues were being discussed in those messages and were being discussed in my other messages, which prompted the government to launch another attack, this time directly on me. I was detained, I was handcuffed, I was humiliated. They wanted to ban me from practicing as a lawyer. And I did receive a ban like that for 1 month. That was examined by the courts. The courts in Poland said that it was all illegal, that the charges were compromising, but not for me, but for the prosecution. The courts said that all those actions against me were groundless. And the courts have called upon the prosecution to stop using the Central Anti-Corruption Office to spy on people using Pegasus. This software was also used against public officials. I've never been a public official, and I wasn't subject to the Central Anti-Corruption Office, that is to monitor the behavior of public officials. So we had the rulings of the courts that were totally in my favor. But that's not the end of the story. I contacted Citizen Lab to have my phone checked for malware. I was aware of the fact that there was a danger that I was being snooped on, and I wanted to find the traces of that surveillance on my smartphone. On the 9th of December last year, I contacted Citizen Lab. And interestingly enough, on the very next day, in the afternoon, the services, the public prosecutor and the government launched another attack against me, just after I have contacted Citizen Lab. I think that needs to be cleared. It needs to be established what has happened. We need some explanations. Next week, let me brief you on that, my lawyers specializing in Italian law are going to make a report to the Italian prosecution. They are going to make a report on the possible illegal use of Pegasus against me in the Republic of Italy. I hope the Italian prosecution will respond to that and launch an investigation. I'm very happy that the European Parliament wants to have a special inquiry committee on that. I've had some experience as a member of the Parliament, and I think that this committee in the European Parliament should work together with the prosecution services in different countries, because that just gives you more leeway, more possibilities, more probability of success. Perhaps the Italians would be willing to work with you to shed some light on that matter, the Italian prosecutor. That's just a suggestion. Everything I'm talking about is about the government trying to intimidate citizens. That's the very nature of an authoritarian state. The authorities want to intimidate citizens. They are surveilling them, they are launching disciplinary cases or criminal cases for that matter. It is typical. But Poland is not Russia. they will not succeed in Poland because there is huge resistance on the part of the citizens. The government is partly self-destructive. It is beginning to fall apart, and I think that Pegasus will be one of the events that will prompt resistance, allowing Poland to defend itself as a democracy. And I hope soon Poland will stop using authoritarian methods to fight the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It is an impressive and in many ways a very scary story. In that sense, I'm very happy that you came to Brussels to share that story and that you continue your work for rule of law, for democracy in Poland in such an impressive way. So thank you very much. We continue, and our next speaker, I'm very happy is here as well, is Mr. Máté Sábó, Director of Programs at the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, where he is responsible for the supervision of strategic litigation cases before domestic and international courts. And we know you, of course, from the case you won before the European Court of Human Rights on illegal surveillance. And thanks to you, we have the right to effective remedies standard in the context of surveillance. So we are honored to have you here, and you also have the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you for inviting me to this public hearing. I'm delighted that you are curious about the perspectives of a human rights organization working at a member state level in one of the European countries where Pegasus was used. My intervention will be about a serious threat to freedoms posed by secret surveillance tools in the hands of the state in the absence of adequate legal safeguards. Hungary is unfortunately a perfect example for this. Not for the reason that many might first think, not because we are witnessing an autocratic exercise of power in Hungary. Fortunately, it is possible to judge this matter on a purely legal basis, independently of the assessment of the current government. In Hungary, the legal system has for many decades lacked the guarantees that would prevent anyone in power from using these instruments for political purposes. In the absence of such guarantees, it depends entirely on the self-restraint of politicians to abuse their power. The example of Hungary teaches us that the existence of a tool is not itself a violation of freedoms, but the absence of limits and guarantees is. The biggest problem with surveillance for national security purposes in Hungary is that there are no precise rules governing and limiting this activity. It was not by chance that the Minister of Interior told the following sentence a few years ago. In Hungary, there is not a single person who cannot be subjected to secret surveillance or interception under legal circumstances. The minister was right. According to our laws, anyone can be surveilled, and surprisingly, this will be in line with the laws. But it doesn't make secret surveillance of citizens lawful, since it breaches their fundamental freedoms. It is a peculiarity of the Hungarian legal system that secret surveillance carried out completely in line with the laws can breach the fundamental rights of individuals. We have known this at least since 2016, when the European Court of Human Rights issued its judgment in a case initiated by me and one of my colleagues. It was the case of Szabó and Vichy versus Hungary. In this judgment, the court held that Hungary had violated our right to respect for private and family life protected by the European Convention of Human Rights. In this judgment, the court found that the Hungarian legislation on secret surveillance measures, namely within the framework of intelligence gathering for national security governed by the law, didn't provide for safeguards sufficiently precise, effective and comprehensive on the ordering, execution and potential redressing of such measures. More precisely, the court concluded that Hungary was reluctant to provide adequate legal guarantees for the protection of private life, as first, the scope of the measures could include virtually anyone. Second, the ordering, the warranting is taking place entirely within the realm of the executive power and without the assessment of strict necessity. Third, new technologies enable the government to intercept masses of data easily concerning even persons outside the original range of operation. And lastly, there are no effective remedial measures, let alone judicial ones. 6 years have passed since the judgment was delivered, but the Hungarian government has still not introduced any general measures to protect the fundamental rights against unjustified secret surveillance. Moreover, there is absolutely no sign of any ongoing legislative movement regarding the implementation of the judgment. The governmental maintenance of the legislative status quo by failing to comply with the court's requirements serves as a breeding ground for systemic abuses of secret intelligence means, as the Pegasus scandal has shown. As the judgment focuses on the lack of guarantees for protecting fundamental freedoms, and the government is sticking to the existing legislation when not implementing the judgment, lessons of the Pegasus case are particularly telling, since it reveals in practice what we can expect from the national legislation currently in place to protect privacy rights against surveillance abuse. In July 2021, Hungarian society was shocked by the news that Hungary was among the countries where journalists, lawyers and activists have been monitored using Pegasus. The fact-finding articles revealed that the phones of more than 300 Hungarian nationals were identified as possible targets for spying with the software. The list included journalists, attorneys at law, activists, opposition politicians, influential citizens with oppositional views, and former heads of the secret services. In my view, the scandal has revealed what happens when adequate legal safeguards for protecting citizens' private life do not counterbalance the possibility of covert surveillance for national security purposes. In other words, the inclusion of Hungary on the list of the countries involved in the scandal closely relates to the lack of guarantees highlighted in the judgment of the Szabó and Vichy case. This is why the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, my organization, provides legal assistance to several individuals monitored using Pegasus software. Our ambition is to find any legal way that allows privacy rights enforcement in an individual case concerning possible abuse to the secret services. It is too early to report any information about the outcomes of these cases, but recent experiences in similar cases suggest little chance of success. Last week, the Hungarian Data Protection Authority published its report after 8 months of investigation of the Pegasus case. According to the report, the authority only examined whether the Pegasus surveillance complied with the law, and the legal basis for the surveillance was always fully established, according to him, whereas the violation lies precisely in the fact that the regulation of surveillance is not protecting fundamental freedoms. An examination of compliance with the laws that allow surveillance on an unprecedented scale and that disregard journalistic protection of sources will never reveal whether the right to privacy and freedom of the press have been infringed. It is precisely these rules that cause fundamental rights violation. Of course, it is important in a state governed by the rule of law that formal rules are properly enforced, but when they perpetuate an unlawful state of affairs, monitoring without their substantive examination is just a charade. This happened with the DPA. In the course of the substantive investigation, the Data Protection Authority couldn't have ignored the fact that the European Court of Human Rights has already ruled that the Hungarian regulation is systemically unlawful. Nor could a real investigation have dealt with the fact that journalists are not subject to different surveillance conditions by law than anyone else. Indeed, in the case of journalists, it would be particularly important that an independent body should authorize surveillance, and it is easy to expose their sources when the protection of sources is a fundamental condition of press freedom. This aspect is not even mentioned in the report of the DPA. The authority's misuse of its role is most clearly demonstrated by the fact that it has initiated criminal proceedings against those who exposed the Pegasus scandal. It would punish those who drew attention to the abusive surveillance instead of taking action against the abuse itself. It wants to punish journalistic sources in a case that is about the lack of protection of journalistic sources. The Hungarian Civil Liberties Union is taking legal actions on behalf of 6 of its clients before the Hungarian authorities, the European Commission, in Israel, and also before the European Court of Human Rights. We aim to expose the practice of secret surveillance to have international fora declare that the Hungarian regulation of secret information gathering is still violating fundamental rights and doesn't prevent politically motivated abuses. As the abuses have several international implications, because the spyware was produced by an Israeli company, and an EU citizen living in Hungary was also targeted, we are launching proceedings outside of Hungary too. I would like to mention 2 cases here. First, we initiated an investigation by the Israeli Attorney General in the cases of 3 clients who were found to have been surveilled. Our aim is to find out how the cyber weapon could have been authorized for export from Israel to a country that doesn't properly regulate secret surveillance. And second, according to our opinion, the surveillance of a Belgian activist who was studying in Hungary at the time of his surveillance is a violation of EU law, namely the right to free movement of persons and workers. Therefore, we filed a complaint representing him with the European Commission. The lack of oversight mechanisms concerning secret services in Hungary, in a comparison to other EU countries, may discourage EU citizens from staying in Hungary, since they cannot expect the same level of protection as they do in the other member states. The lack of legal safeguards against the abuse of power is not an internal affair of a member state. Any European citizen can become a target in Hungary. If there can be such great differences between the legal systems of the European member states in terms of the level of protection of freedom, if there are countries where such protection is practically non-existent, then it is also questionable whether the European Union guarantees freedom, security and justice without internal borders. That is why Europe must pay attention to the Hungarian example of using Pegasus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Szabo, for your interesting contribution, and to also underline how important not only the legal framework in theory is, but the fundamental values upon which it rests. Because your comment that, according to the Hungarian system, it might be within the legal framework, but it's still unlawful, I think is very relevant in the discussions that we have here today. Thank you so much for that. And we move to the last speaker of our public hearing today, and we give the floor to Mr. Bill Marczak from the Citizen Lab. He's a senior research fellow and focuses on novel technological threats to internet freedom, including new censorship and surveillance tools. Your work has been fundamental in revealing many of the cases of spying we have also heard about today, and we are very happy to have you with us today, and I give you immediately the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you to the committee for having me here today. Of course, my name is Bill Marczak, and I work at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. And I've been studying Pegasus spyware in particular since 2016, but government use of spyware more generally since 2012. I have a PhD in computer science from the University of California at Berkeley, and I conducted my dissertation research for my PhD on this exact topic of government use, or in many cases, abuse of spyware. The details of the precise technical methodology we use in our research at Citizen Lab is beyond the scope of my 10-minute introductory speech here today, but I can say at a high level that we work closely with civil society and activists in a number of countries and forensically analyze devices such as computers and phones to check for technical evidence of hacking. And when we find evidence that someone has been hacked or maybe targeted, sometimes we're able to attribute the spyware to a particular company that supplied the spyware or a government that used it, and trace it in some cases to other countries or other entities that might be using the same spyware. Predictably, some of the first cases that we found in our research early on were countries where authoritarian practices by the government are commonplace. So we found some initial misuse in the Middle East, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Of course, these governments back in 2011, 2012 were spying on Arab Spring protesters to undermine domestic opposition that was happening there. But a funny thing happened as we continued to do our research and track these sorts of spyware technologies around the world. We found evidence that more and more democratic governments were becoming customers of these spyware companies. And I want to make 2 points about the impact of spyware like Pegasus on democracy. And then I want to conclude by making one final point about the spyware companies themselves, because I think it's important to understand the nature of the companies and their role in the product. But the first point I want to make about governments using Pegasus domestically. And in order to make this point, I'm going to ask you to think of something else, which is radiation, or if you like, radioactive materials. So if you're someone who's handling a radioactive material without proper protections and procedures, what can happen? Well, you may be exposed to radiation, and this can cause injury to you or to others, but maybe the injury is not visible right away. Maybe it takes years and years to manifest, over which you slowly develop a cancer. And once that cancer develops in one area of your body, it can spread to other areas, and you can become very sick, maybe so sick that you cannot be healed. And since the sickness is not observed until so long after the exposure, it may be quite tricky to link the injury to the improper handling years and years ago. And the analogy I'm drawing here is that spyware like Pegasus has a similar effect, but on democracies themselves. Consider the revelations we heard about today in Poland of spying on lawyers and politicians whose phones were hacked not just once or twice, but repeatedly in the run-up to important elections. So were those elections fair? Well, of course, freedom and fairness of elections is an issue in and of itself. But if there is one election that is not free and fair, what happens after that election? Remember, the people who won the election, fair or unfair, control the levers of power. And we only have to consult today's earlier testimony by Roman Giertek, a Pegasus victim himself, to get an idea of how this can progress in a democracy. And of course, we've seen similar revelations from Hungary too, thanks to the Pegasus Project and Forbidden Stories. And we've seen reports and indications, in fact, of many other European governments considering purchasing these sorts of spywares or signing contracts for the spyware. And of course, the companies like NSO Group that sell the spyware say that it should be used against criminals and terrorists. That's the proper way to use it. But of course, without very strict independent oversight and strict controls over its use, the technology can be mishandled, accidentally or even deliberately, and it can have this slow, deeply corrosive effect on democratic institutions over time if it's left unchecked, which is why the European Parliament's investigative effort is so critical. But the second point that I want to make is more about the national security dimensions here. Because remember, one of the other major findings from the Pegasus project was that there was this possibility that the phone of the French president and the phones of French cabinet ministers may have been hacked by the Moroccan government. But is this really so shocking? What is preventing a foreign government from spying in Europe with Pegasus or any other spyware? Well, we know that NSO Group has a country-based licensing model. So what this means is that if some Pegasus customer wants permission to spy on, let's say, parliamentarians in Brussels, for example, then it has to purchase that permission from NSO Group to spy in Belgium. The customer, once it has this permission, types in the number, and if it's a country where they have the license, and when they type in the target's number, more often than not, the target's phone gets hacked. So that's really the barrier here, is this country-based model. But once you have access to a country, You can target a lot of different people in that country. And indeed, we have seen that some foreign customers, such as the customer believed to be the Rwandan government, are licensed to spy in Belgium. But of course, the national security here goes a little bit deeper. It also extends to the European customers of Pegasus themselves, because the big question about Pegasus is who exactly gets to see the information that is extracted from the phones. Now, what we've concluded in our research is that there is some centralized entity, perhaps, in fact, maybe even likely NSO itself, that sets up servers for all the different customers, and the information that is taken from the hacked phones flows through these servers. But where exactly does it go? Well, clearly the Pegasus customer that initiated the surveillance is getting that information. But might it be going somewhere else too? Well, we've seen the unfolding Pegasus scandal in Israel, which has included not only revelations about the Israeli police abuse of the spyware, but also revelations about how the company itself operates. And we've seen revelations including that NSO Group CEO has very frequent, sometimes even daily, meetings with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. We've also seen cases, in fact, one case that I worked on, NSO Group even took the extreme and unusual step of notifying a long-time Pegasus target, in other words, someone's phone who had been under surveillance for some time, but they did this notification only after I myself notified the very same target. NSO said they received information that led to this notification. From whom? They did not say. But if someone wasn't looking, how did they know? So these are my 2 points about the impact on democracy. Not only is this potentially corrosive when used domestically, but it's a serious national security risk. And the national security risk is not only foreign governments using Pegasus against European targets, but it's also from domestic European customers using Pegasus against domestic European targets, because these targets might in turn be monitored by a foreign third party. In closing, I want to make my final point about the nature of NSO Group and these other companies that are part of this spyware industry. We often use the word tool or product to refer to spyware like Pegasus, but we can't forget the role of the company, like NSO Group, which goes well beyond simply building and selling a product and washing their hands. A tool like Pegasus is mostly useless without constant updates, maintenance, and help from NSO. And of course, there are a whole ecosystem of other entities that support NSO, including companies that sell software and hardware to NSO, including exploits to break into phones. And let's not forget the investors that sustain the company. And let's also keep in mind that NSO Group is not alone in this industry. We've seen reports on other companies, Candiru and Quadream out of Israel. And yes, there are also European companies playing in this industry too. And I think it's important in the context of any investigation or potential regulatory effort to keep in mind that this technology is mostly useless without the ongoing service provided by the company. And any approach to investigating and regulating should seek to uncover more about the ongoing role of the companies and target that rather than, focusing on just the technology itself. Anyway, those are the points I wanted to make. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you for being with us today. And even though you said that 10 minutes was probably too short to go into all the details, I think what you managed to present here in 10 minutes is already very, very impressive and very interesting. And you said that the investigation efforts of this European Parliament are crucial. I think your and your organization's assistance in our efforts would be crucial as well. So maybe we can already agree to come back when we have a little bit more time, even to also look at those technical details in detail, because I think that's very important. Thank you so much for now. Now we've had all our speakers. I would like to open the question and answer round. We have some time to do this. I noticed that online, and I'm also honored by this, we are joined by Christoph Brecha, who was already mentioned earlier today as another prominent victim of the use of Pegasus by the Polish government. So I would first give him the floor to also inform us of his point of view on this whole situation, his personal situation. So Mr. Brecha, you have the floor first, and if there are other people who would like to take the floor to raise a question, please either raise your name tag here in the Parliament or press the raise hand button online. Thank you very much, and now to Mr. Christoph Brecha. Please press the speak button.
Dzień dobry, witam wszystkich.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm very happy that I can take the floor and participate in this event. I was told about this surveillance thing on the 23rd of December 2021. I got this information from Citizen Lab. On the 10th of January, I received the results of an analysis conducted by Amnesty International. Well, it transpired that my phone had been hacked. It lasted for a year, starting from the end of April till October 2019. There were 33 attacks. Pegasus was used to launch those attacks against me. The experts from Citizen Lab have looked into that and said that those are massive attacks, that the perpetrators must have been very determined, and they really wanted to hack my phone. Back then, I was responsible for the election campaign of the main opposition party, the Citizens Coalition, the Civic Coalition, the main opposition group, composed mainly of Civic Platform, which is a member of EPP. I was working for this coalition that was the main opposition group in that election. I had this job in the period from June till October 2019. A few days after the elections, the attacks stopped. Therefore, there can be no doubts whatsoever what the target of this attack was. Pegasus was used in order to retrieve information about the work of Civic Platform in the run-up to the elections. This surveillance was also ongoing in April when I was a member of a committee of inquiry in the Polish Parliament. Back then I was also running for the European Parliament. Pegasus was also used, therefore, against someone running in the elections for the European Parliament. After the elections to the European Parliament, the scale of the surveillance has gone down a bit and then intensified again when I was working on the Polish elections. All the contacts, messages, videos, audio have been intercepted. They were eavesdropping on our talks with the leaders of opposition group in Poland. They were intercepting the information on our strategies, on the draft electoral lists for the Sejm, the lower chamber of the parliament, and the Senate, the upper chamber of the Polish parliament. They were even interested in such trivial issues as layout, colors, logos, posters. All such materials are naturally present on computers and phones. They are important for the campaign, and it was all intercepted. Of course, the substantive issues such as our political programs were also intercepted. My text messages have been stolen. They were tampered with, they were doctored, they were modified, and they were used in a smear campaign against me. When the first attack was launched, they've stole my text messages and they changed them in order to have a smear campaign against me. This was the same period as the campaign for the elections to the parliament. Therefore, in order to prove what happened to me, you do not only need to look into the reports of Amnesty International and Citizens Lab, but you only need to watch the public TV, which used those doctored messages from my phone. I did notify the public prosecution in Poland. I reported that, but they did not react. The prosecution is politicized. This is an awkward issue. They are being very slow. They had a month to react. They took 4 months to launch an investigation. There was one hearing. They asked a few questions, and that's it. There is no willingness on their part to shed some light onto this shocking issue. Just one more thing I have to add. Those methods that were used against me, stealing my correspondence, eavesdropping, wiretapping, snooping, changing the correspondence for the purpose of the smear campaign, doctoring the messages, all this rings a faint bell. Such tactics were used in the 80s under communism. I'm very sorry. I'm deeply sorry that this is happening again in democratic Poland. Thank you very much. I'm willing to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for being with us today, for taking the time, and for sharing your personal story here today. I think it's very impressive, and it provides another element to what we've discussed already today. And if there's any questions to you personally, of course, we'd be happy to give you the floor back later. We move now to the questions, the people asking for the floor here in the room. And first is Bartusz Arlukowicz.
Bardzo dziękuję za...
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair, for organizing this hearing. I think it's crucial for the future and quality of democracy, not only in Poland, in Europe. This is not only a Polish issue, it's a cross-border problem, so to speak. Today, Roman Giertych says that, according to him, Donald Tusk has been targeted, which means that any European politician, any of us, could find themselves under an attack. Therefore, we absolutely need to look into this. It's probably not going to happen in Poland because they are going to mount obstacles and block this investigation. But we, as the members of the European Parliament, have a task of protecting our citizens, because there is an attempt to destroy the European institutions, to undermine the European institutions in order to be creating their own authoritarian regimes. Mr. Breza said that the attacks took place during the campaign in the run-up to the European elections. I have a question to Citizen Lab, Mr. Bill Marczak. I hope I understood you correctly. Did you say that the secret services using this system, Pegasus, in order to receive the results, do they need to get it from Israel? Is it Israel that is providing them with results? Which would mean that the customer simply receives the data from Israel? This was my first question. Now moving on to the second question, because there is something that I didn't quite grasp. What happens after the system has been used? What happens to the audio, video, messages, recordings? Is it being stored on a server of NSO? Am I correct? Is it on the Israeli servers, and is there no control and scrutiny of the state consent over it? And one more question. According to the media, Polish secret services using Pegasus, I'm quoting the media here, I want to highlight this, so I'm invoking the media, the news here. But according to the journalists, secret services at some point lost the license to use Pegasus because of abuse and misuse. If that happened, what are the rules that the Polish secret services allegedly broke? What is the code of conduct, the rules of procedure? What are the rules for destroying the material obtained like this? Following your presentation, I would really like an answer to those questions. Thank you very much, Chair, one more time. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move to our colleague Kowood, please.
Thank you, Chair, for the floor. I will speak in Polish.
Mr. Giertych made this quote about the canary in a coal mine. I would use a different metaphor. It's like a prison. It's like a digital prison, which gives you the possibility of creating a false image of the person intercepted in the eyes of the public opinion. The Black Mirror is happening now. It's very easy to put some materials onto someone's phone and to have a smear campaign against this person. Later you may explain as much as you like, but the breaking news will always prevail. So you'll never get rid of this bad reputation. A question to Mr. Giertych. Do you know anything about that? About Polish propaganda using Pegasus to produce fake news and for the purpose of disinformation? Thank you.
Thank you. And González Pons.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and congratulations for this hearing. I think that it's been very, very, very useful. And I had no doubts, but if I had had any doubt about creating an inquiry committee in this Parliament, now I've forgotten it, or I should have forgotten it, because it's obvious that this is a typical case for an inquiry committee in the European Parliament. What I've understood very clearly is that this is not a Polish case. This is a European case. The only thing is that it is in Poland where we have more information about it now, but only now. What we don't know is what we are going to find in any other country of the European Union, because it has to be for sure that the Polish or the Hungarian government are not the only governments using Pegasus or misusing Pegasus. So I think that it's absolutely justified to create an inquiry committee in this Parliament, not about Poland or Hungary, about Pegasus, and not about two countries, about all the European countries, because perhaps those governments who have done the dark work more openly are those that we have seen what they did. But perhaps there are governments using same technology and we don't know. Roman has said that Pegasus is the canary in the mine. Forgive me for saying this. It is not true. You are the canary. Pegasus is the mine. Pegasus is the gas. And you are the canary who is telling us what's going on and what could happen to all of us. And we have to hear what you are saying. So let me ask if you agree with what I'm saying, if you agree with that Poland, Hungary are not the only cases, and perhaps this inquiry committee is going to find some surprising countries misusing Pegasus or any other similar technology.
Thank you, Mr. González Pons. And remotely connected, we have our colleague Patrick Breyer. Please, Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor and for organizing this meeting. First of all, I would like to encourage all victims who have joined this meeting to take the matter to the courts and ensure that, for example, it is clarified that any legislation that might cover this, such as legislation on intelligence services in Hungary is not compatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. And we can get that clarification only if you sue the services over these actions. So I'd be interested to hear, have you considered this? And my second question goes to the representative of the Citizen Lab, because as much it's a scandal that these technologies, the spyware, is being abused for political reasons. The technical question really is, why is that possible? Why are our devices so insecure? And since you have examined these attacks exactly, what are your recommendations to us to make devices secure, to secure them against those attacks, to make sure that there are no bugs or that they're being closed immediately? What are your recommendations to policy-wise when it comes to, for example, obliging manufacturers to provide updates, or maybe making them liable for not doing so? I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Rosa Thun.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'm very happy that Esteban has no doubts as far as the inquiry committee is concerned, and I am positive that all political groups will intensely work together on clarifying in depth this horrible story of which any of us can be victim. And of course, we must together protect at least European citizens from such horrible experiences in the future. The stealth of privacy is a crime. And that's exactly what we hear from all of you. So thank you very much for organizing this. And I hope that our work on the inquiry committee will start soon, work smoothly, and that we will really bring to very concrete results, and that it will be a work that we will deliver not only here in the European Parliament, but we will cooperate with organizations, experts, etc. And I do believe that we bring very concrete and positive results. Now, I would like to ask, this Italian, ślad włoski, Italian trace, seems to me extremely important. And is it possible that a citizen of Poland whose telephone is registered in Poland is spied on in Italy without participation of the operators there, without their participation, without the participation of Italian operators? We will have many questions of that kind, and the work has to continue for a longer time. But I have the impression that this issue of a Polish telephone proprietor, of a proprietor of a Polish telephone number being spied in Italy is something that we really must look into. And my second question would be to our Hungarian friends. I'm sorry that I don't know it, but among our colleagues here in the European Parliament, it's a very emotional, I would say, issue, this Pegasus story in Hungary. But is it in Hungary also as important as it seems to be in Poland? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isabelle Wiesler.
Merci. Je vais parler en français. Merci.
I'll speak French. Thank you very much for organising this hearing, because I think it's extremely important. There are a few things I'd like to pick up on. First of all, it seems obvious that this is a European question. It's not just a Polish or a Hungarian question. That this constitutes attack on fundamental rights, and this really is the basis of our society. And also picking on what Mr. Sabo said, the big problem is that there aren't any safeguards, that there aren't any checks and balances, there aren't any guarantees, because in fact the difference between certain countries and others is that when you discover that there are things that aren't working, as unacceptable surveillance of individuals would be, then governments should fall heads should roll. And yet, in Poland, it seems a lot more complicated than that. And in Hungary, it was just said that anything that is subject to investigation will be confidential, secret, for a number of years, which would actually prevent any investigation. So this is where I see the danger for democracy. We're seeing us going along paths which are not towards democracy, but towards autocracy. Now we've got more information. We understand that these things that are happening, some people consider as normal. And that is a problem as well. And that is why I think we need to underscore the problem we see in Hungary. Obviously, we have to continue to work on everything, on all fronts. Just one final point, and I'll wind up. The NSO seems to be very present in everything we're discussing here. It would have been nice to have heard the role that they have been playing in the various stages. So I'm wondering what Citizen Lab could tell us on that, because that seems to be the focal point. That seems to be, everything seems to pass by them. They're the spider in the web. You know, it's not just a question about information that we're looking for, but it seems that this is being centralized. So if Citizen Lab could tell us about that, that would be extremely interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have any other requests for the floor. Let me just add maybe one or two short questions. Maybe first to the journalist or the editor-in-chief and the director for Forbidden Stories. During your investigations, both in Europe and outside of Europe, because indeed it's not only a Polish or a Hungarian issue, not even a European issue, it's very much a global issue. Have you also seen the consequences? Have you written the consequences of what happened as a result of these attacks? Do we see investigations being stopped? Do we see journalists taking a step back? What kind of effects do we have? Do we have seen people that ended up in danger or not? Then there were already questions about sort of the technical regulations in order to protect our devices. A couple of the speakers also hinted at a regulatory approach as a result of maybe also the inquiry committee. And are there any suggestions as to where a regulatory approach might lead us? Is this in the area of trade restrictions, or like the Americans who've blacklisted NSO as a company? Is it in the area of investment? Is it in the investment in other areas? And then maybe specifically to Mr. Szabo, you're taking now a case to the Court of Justice on freedom of movement, which I think is a very innovative approach. But is that really the only legislation we have at the European level that would allow you to take a case of such fundamental breaches of fundamental rights to the Court of Justice? Or is there other legislation that we have at the European Union that could also serve as a helpful tool in this? Now, since there were a couple of general questions, there were a couple of specific questions to individual panelists, I propose that we, in the same order, give all the panelists the floor, starting with Laurent Richard and Sandrine Rigaud. If everybody could stick maybe to 5 minutes, we can also conclude the hearing nicely on time. So if you agree, I would give the floor for 5 minutes to Forbidden Stories to respond to some of the general questions that were asked, and also if you want to respond to some of the comments and stories of the other panelists that you didn't hear yet before you spoke before. So please, you have the floor.
Pour répondre, merci pour ces questions. Pour répondre à la première, en tout cas, qui concerne les conséquences.
I'm afraid this sound is not good enough for the interpreters to work from.
Évidemment, observer cet espionnage dans une dizaine de pays qui sont loin toutes d'être des exemples de démocratie.
I'm sorry, I do apologize for interrupting, but it seems that the sound quality is not very good for the interpreters to work with. So I'm not sure if we can do something to fix the sound quality, and if not, we'll have to do it without interpretation for now. let's try again and see what the interpreters say.
Is it better like this? Is the sound better?
I think so. Can you speak a little bit more?
Yes, of course. I will answer your first question. Je vais répondre à votre, pardon, en français. Je vais répondre à votre première question sur les dommages de la cybersurveillance sur les victimes. J'espère que vous entendez bien. Donc, ce qu'on a pu observer...
Excusez-moi. What we're going to do is we're going to refresh your connection so that we can activate the microphone you're using now. And I think in order to not lose any time, I will first give the floor to Roman Gittrich, who is with us and who we are confident has excellent sound quality today. So please.
Chciałem najpierw się odnieść do tego, co powiedział.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer to what Mr. Gonzalez has just said. He said that I was the canary. But let us be aware of the fact that a canary in a coal mine had an important role to play. When methane was there, the canary was the first to die. I'm still alive. So I think this is the main difference. I'm not dead yet. But it is true. It is true that if you look at the Citizens Lab report, I was one of the first cases that have been reported on with respect to Poland and Pegasus. You asked, we were wondering whether it's only about Poland or it's a wider issue. Well, it is a wider issue. Because let me give you the following example. Let us imagine that when I was talking to Donald Tusk, and I was talking to him frequently in the period in question, perhaps you could well imagine that we made a joke, we pronounced a sentence that could have been taken out of context and used to attack the whole institution of the European Council. We all know that when talking privately, we say many things taken out of context. It could be used against us for a number of purposes. This did not happen in our specific case. Fortunately, I think we are being cautious after all. And there was nothing used against us. There was nothing sensational there. Nothing they could get their teeth into. But one could imagine that a sentence pronounced by the President of the European Council is taken out of context and used to destroy the image of the whole EU. When it comes to Pegasus being used in the other countries, I would like to say the following. There is a debate on using new technologies to fight terrorism. This is a debate. But the Polish specificity is that this wasn't used to fight terrorism or human trafficking. Let me assure you that I wasn't guilty of terrorism or human trafficking. It was used for political purposes. If such state-of-the-art tools are used for political purposes and not to fight criminals, then you have a problem. Of course, you could also talk about the boundaries and limits when it comes to using those tools to fight criminals, but our case is clear-cut. There was no criminal activity there. The instruments were used for political purposes to eliminate political opponents, basically. A party using such tools is an enormous advantage because it can spy on the opposition parties, on people organizing campaigns, on the potential candidates for the position of the president. I don't think we can talk about fair elections in a situation when one party has such a huge advantage, such a huge privilege as compared to the others. This will be very important also in the context of the next elections to the European Parliament. If such tools were used in the run-up to the presidential elections, parliamentary elections in Poland, you can well imagine that one of the political groups or political parties will try to score better by using such tools against its opponents. If I do run out of time, please tell me, because I do not know how much time I have.
Pani poseł
There was a question to me about Italy. Is it possible that Pegasus was used in Italy on a Polish phone? I did consult the experts from Citizen Lab specifically about that issue. John Skyrayton said that it's absolutely possible, because the fact that you go abroad and that there is a different operator doesn't change anything, because the Pegasus, the software, is installed on your device, on your specific device, so the operator, the number are not important. The operator is not an issue here. It's on your device. And I know I was being snooped on in Italy, because there is the Citizens Lab report that I have provided to you, and there is all this logging data and relogging, because sometimes the system gets logged off and needs to log in again. I looked at the dates, and I know that I was in Italy back then, so I have 100% certainty that Pegasus was used against me when I was in Italy. And therefore, I want the prosecution in Rome to deal with that. It seems that the jurisdiction is correct, because I have those material confirming the dates. In this situation, the Italian prosecution can also act in all the other cases related to that case concerning the attacks on me, because there is a jurisdiction that has been established. Were the material used for propaganda? That was another question. The use of hacked materials for propaganda purposes. People who had access to my phone have entered my professional mailbox, and they were able to intercept my correspondence between me and my clients. Those emails were published and put on public TV. I was surprised. I thought perhaps it was the client who shared this data, but it has all been hacked. So to put it in a nutshell, we are talking here about the materials covered by professional secrecy of a lawyer. The password was intercepted illegally, the materials were intercepted illegally, the hack was illegal, the materials were downloaded illegally, they were also transferred to Israel illegally, and they were published. All the possible provisions on human rights, privacy, professional secrecy have been broken here. All the freedoms that are there in any civilized country have been violated here. Plus, of course, personally, it's a blow to your dignity. You know that the secret services are with you in bed, are with you when you go to church, to confession, are with you when you meet your friends. It's an experience that is hard to describe. It's very hard and painful for me and my family. When we are talking about new technologies, I think all the boundaries are being crossed, because what it does to you is that next time when you are having a private conversation, you cannot help wondering whether or not on the next day you will see it on TV, doctored, modified and used for a smear campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to try once again with our colleagues from Forbidden Stories to see if the sound connection is now better, please.
Is it better like this with this microphone? We heard that it might be better. Is the connection is good? If it's good, I can go on.
It seems okay to me.
Okay. So yeah, just to answer briefly your question, the first part of your question was about for what kind of reasons people were targeted and what kind of consequences they were suffering. We have seen in all those numbers some numbers of people like the journalist Cecilio Pineda, who was in Mexico, who was killed. We don't make any kind of connection between the fact that his number is appearing in the list and the fact that he was killed. But I can tell you about an idea about the profile of the victim. We have seen as well that the fiancée of Jamal Khashoggi, Atice, while she was waiting for her husband, for Jamal Khashoggi, to get out from the consulate, she was targeted as well at the very same time. We have seen the phone numbers of Khadija Ismailova, a journalist in Azerbaijan, who is one of the only last independent voices in Azerbaijan, who is doing her work as investigative reporters about the corruption of the Ilham Aliyev regime. And she was targeted so many times over the years. So that can tell you what kind of profile we find in this data set and what kind of consequences so for them, because it's when as a journalist you are targeted with that kind of spyware, people want to know who is talking to you, people want to know who is your source, what would be your next stories, and what would be your revelation. Regarding about some solutions about the future, one question is since it's a very European issue because of the main shareholders that is European, because of a lot of customers are based in the EU, the first thing we need, at least as a journalist or any kind of citizens, we need transparency. We need transparency from the EU state members. We need the Inquiry Commission to get some answer from them and to hear from each state an answer to this question: did you buy Pegasus license? And if you did so, how you using that? So we need some transparency on that. And I don't know if the EU is able to do as the US just did last November by blacklisting the company NSO, or by taking any kind of strong regulation to protect the citizens. That's very interesting to know. But the issue, honestly, is not NSO itself or the Pegasus itself. We see other companies who are really under the radar now, who are the next NSO, who are ready to deliver the next Pegasus. And so the question is not only about NSO and Pegasus, the question is about how to control the use of that kind of weapon, because we are talking about a weapon. That's cyber weapons, and I think we are currently facing this big issue that is a worldwide issue, because a lot of us were not considering that as a weapon. But as a weapon, it's creating a lot of damages in the life of millions of potentially people. So it's a huge concern, and we hope that the Inquiry Commission will bring some answers to the public opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we move to Mr. Mate Jabou.
Yes, thank you. I received two questions, and I would like to answer them briefly. The first one was about whether the use of Pegasus is an important issue in Hungary. My answer is definitely yes, because it touches the fundamentals of the existing public power. We have been experiencing the limitless use of power of the government for a decade. And this is why I think that beyond the actual surveillance, the impact of the mere possibility of the unrestricted surveillance must also be addressed. The fear of being observed encourages people to practice self-censorship in their private lives. And this is not something new in Hungary. Self-censorship has been the practice for many years. The institutions of protection of the journalistic sources of attorney and client privilege are intended to counterbalance the overbearing power of the state, which surveillance makes impossible. A free and fair election cannot be held in those if those in power can see their opponents' strategies and discourages their supporters by allowing surveillance. We will have election this spring. If we feel that anyone can be watched, it also paralyzes critical citizen action. The new proofs of such an abuse of power when new proofs of such an abuse of power are revealed, it adds new layers to our already existing experiences from this government. This scandal was revealed 8 months ago, so several months elapsed till then. And since then, almost every 1 or 2 weeks, new targets are being identified by the fact-finding journalists. all newly identified victims with different stories add additional layers to the scandal. So it keeps the level of the importance high. The second question was about our initiated proceedings before the EU institutions. We have a hope that the Commission will launch an infringement proceeding against Hungary related to the use of Pegasus, but unfortunately, the operation of national security services is in general outside of the competence of the institutions of the European Union. So when we are setting up a strategy for litigation, for example, in this affair, where we want to protect the fundamental rights of privacy and the freedom of the press, we also have to find something that makes the EU institutions competent. And this is why I was talking about that we have to make a connection to the free movement of individuals. This will not the main basis of this proceeding, but this connection is needed to let the EU institutions intervene. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then for the final answers, we move back to Mr. Bill Marchak from Citizen Lab. Please.
Thank you. So I got a bunch of questions. I'll try as best I can to answer them. So I believe the first series of questions were regarding the role of Israel or NSO Group in the use, the collection of data, and the government customer obtaining the data. These are very good questions, and unfortunately, I don't have full answers to all of them. The best way to find out these answers, I think, would be to get more information through an investigation into how specifically the customer, the operator of the spyware works. What do they see? Where do they get the information from the spyware? Is it directly pushed to them? Are they downloading it from the NSO cloud or from Israel somewhere? Those are all very good questions, and unfortunately I don't have very precise answers for those. But I think that an investigation into the operators, that involves talking to the operators and the operators disclosing information and documents would help reveal some of that. As to the question about what happens if and when a license is revoked, I'm also unsure as to whether the data that was collected is destroyed or whether that data stays around. We've seen reporting indicating that the data stays around. It's not erased if the license is lost or the system is terminated. But it's hard to know with 100% certainty. I'll now try and address the question as to why our devices, why our phones are so insecure, and what are the recommendations about how to better secure these devices. I think to the first question about the insecurity of devices, it's certainly true that the devices that we use are extremely, extremely complicated. They involve millions or tens of millions of lines of computer code that are written by hundreds or thousands or perhaps even tens of thousands of developers. And speaking as a computer scientist, it is a major unsolved problem in computer science, and indeed, in some cases, an unsolvable problem to write completely secure software or to develop things that are immune to any sort of vulnerability. In general, there will always be vulnerabilities in sufficiently complex software. That's not to say it's a lost cause. What we've seen specifically with the attacks from NSO's Pegasus spyware is that they exploit flaws in messaging apps. So we saw in 2019, NSO Group was exploiting a vulnerability in WhatsApp, where the operator of the spyware would send a malicious WhatsApp call that would ring on a phone 2 or 3 times and then would disappear from the call logs. It would not show up in the call logs, but it would be the vector for delivering the spyware onto the phone by taking advantage of a security flaw inside WhatsApp. And of course, we've seen NSO Group time and time again deploy exploits against iMessage, which is Apple's messaging app, which is built in to every single iPhone that's shipped all around the world. And we've seen NSO Group exploit many vulnerabilities against this app. I think, though, some advice for people to protect against these attacks, well, first of all, it's very hard. The advice involves mainly disabling messaging apps that you don't use. So if you don't use iMessage, you can turn it off. If you don't use WhatsApp, you can uninstall it. But look, we all need to communicate. We all need, phones, the whole purpose of the phone is to communicate with other people. So at the end of the day, you're going to have to use some messaging apps, and there's some vulnerability that you can't control just through personal behavior. So I think we do need some sort of standards or perhaps guidelines for design of these messaging apps, because they're so vulnerable and because they're constantly processing data received from the internet. They are targeted for attack because anything running in the background on your phone, constantly processing data from the internet, is a potential vector for compromise. So I think there needs to be some sort of standards for design of these apps, or some sort of best practices maybe for design of these apps. For example, one area that could be improved is the handling of messages from unknown senders. Because one feature of all of these attacks, the messages that are malicious, that are infecting the phone, or the missed calls that are malicious through WhatsApp that are infecting the phone, they're not coming from your friends. They're coming from numbers, email addresses, identifiers that you don't know, that aren't in your address book. So this is perhaps, we should perhaps take some of the details of this conversation offline to a more technical venue, but I think that there can definitely be improvements in these messaging apps with how they process messages from unknown or untrusted senders, because that's a very common vector we see time and time again. And I think there was one final question about the involvement of NSO Group in the various stages of the spying and the hacking of the phones. And again, it's hard to say with 100% certainty. We did see a very interesting report, however, today in an Israeli newspaper that is covering the Pegasus scandal in Israel with the Israeli police. And this report said that NSO Group often claims that the customer is the one who is operating the system from their premises. In other words, the information is stored on the customer premises, the exploits are being sent, the phones are being hacked, by the customer from the customer premises. But the report said, even though NSO claims this, that's not actually the case. And the report, relying on a single source, so take from that what you will, basically said that NSO Group themselves is running at least some of the servers that are involved in hacking of the phones and receiving of the information and processing of the information. So there's a possibility that NSO is indeed involved more deeply than we think, and I think this is a good target for this investigation and other investigations to pursue.
Thank you very much, and I take your suggestion to maybe take this at some point to a more technical setting offline, also as an invitation in the work that we're going to do in this Parliament in the next months, hopefully, because I think that would be very valuable also in order to improve the way we do these things in the future. Thank you to all the speakers. We have a little bit of time left, so I would like to pass the floor back to Andrzej Halicki to make some concluding remarks. Please, Andrzej, you have the floor.
Dziękuję serdecznie.
Thank you very much. It was an extremely interesting sessions of questions and answers. Having listened to the expert Bill Marczak, I can just agree with what has been said, i.e. that we need to continue having those hearings on technologies, but first and foremost on defending citizens, consumers against illegal and unwanted surveillance. One more comment on this news that has been referred to here. When it comes to Pegasus and Predator and all those state-of-the-art spyware, the situation has changed. It's not the customer, it's not the owner of the phone that needs to do something incorrectly to be hacked. It's not about opening a dodgy document, opening a link, downloading something dodgy. This is not how it works, because it's a non-click procedure. Even if you're not using your phone, even when it's there somewhere on standby, it can become infected. And it can also infect your contacts. So this is not about the owner doing something to facilitate this attack. Of course, all this makes such technologies even more dangerous. We, as the member of the parliament, will try to protect the election procedures, will try to provide safeguards. But we need to think about potential legislation, potential legal standards. Some instruments are already at our disposal, such as GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and directives on police cooperation, which make it possible for the police to tackle international crime. The Commission, the European Commission, should look into how those directives are being implemented. The technological progress is very quick, and it is forcing us to rethink our concept of safety and legal standards. By way of conclusion, I would like to say something which I guess everyone will subscribe to. We need to continue this dialogue. There is a debate in Strasbourg. We need more information. We need more data, including on what is happening in other member states, not only Hungary and Poland, because I think this is an operation on a large scale, what is being done with Pegasus. But as the chair has rightly pointed out, it's a global phenomenon. I'm also wondering, and I would like to ask Bill Marczak, because I think that your contribution has been perhaps the greatest one here to bringing all this to the light. Are there representatives of governments among the customers, clients of Citizens Lab in one of the countries in question? Are there representatives of the government involved? Perhaps it's a question for the next meeting, but there is some information that points to that. I think that was a great hearing. Thank you very much, Chair, for chairing it so efficiently. We are going to talk about the Committee of Inquiry, but first we need to have as much data, facts and figures as possible, and next week there will be a debate. Thank you.
Thank you, and because everybody was very disciplined in their speeches and answers, we'll actually manage to conclude this hearing on time, which is quite unique in this House, let me assure you. And I think it's important, maybe as a final comment from my side, I'll be very brief. You know, I think everybody made very clear this is not only a Polish or a Hungarian issue, it's a European issue. Actually, it's a global issue. It's also not only about Pegasus, but it's about all that kind of technology and the way it has been used. And we spoke a lot about the canary in the coal mine. And of course, regardless of who is the canary in this metaphor and who is the methane, I think it's very important that at least the coal mine for us is Europe as a whole. And when one canary is attacked, I think we are all at risk. And because we will all be at risk, I think it's important, like Andrei Halicki also said, to continue our work on this issue, to intensify our work on this issue. I would like to really thank all the speakers of today's session, and by thanking them, also invite them to stay closely connected to the work that we're going to undertake here in this Parliament, because I think it will be very valuable if we can continue to cooperate together on this issue in order to improve the way we defend democracy, defend rule of law, and defend the fundamental freedoms of our citizens in the whole of the European Union. So thank you very much, and until the next time. Thank you.